But of course, it's true that racism can exist in the form of one person having a particular nasty view about some other person. But Fanon shows that the primary reality of racism is deeper than that in two quite important ways. You know, if you come to a party and you're there by yourself, you don't know anyone there, you stand there and everything you do feels awkward. But then, when your friends get there, you talk to them, everything feels good again, and everything just happens normally. That shows something about the importance of other people to our basic experience of agency. When we're alienated from other people and we feel like we're being looked at, our being an object for them makes everything not work. On the other hand, when we're with people who support us, things go very smoothly. Well, now imagine that instead of it just being you at a presumably friendly event of a party where you just have this hang-up about everybody looking at you, imagine that instead of that, you're actually in an environment where people don't like you. And imagine that's the permanent environment in which you have to build your life. Right? Fanon's point is that's more or less the experience of black people in the white world. Black people in the white world have to grow up and function in a world where that world projects onto them a sense that they're deficient. And Fanon's point is that that's a thing that affects people at the basic level of their experience of agency. Normally, he says, we live from a body schema, right? Which is to say, we don't think about our bodies. We just have them there, ready to help us when we need things to be done. When he wants to strike a match to smoke his pipe, his hand just turns out to be there. Happens to know where the match is, happens to know what to do, happens to know where the pipe is. That's the normal way people's bodies function. They're just the available power to do whatever it is we need to do. But Fanon says that the lived experience of the black person is that sense of the comfortable, immediate body schema is interrupted by the gaze of the other, by the gaze of the white world. Because the white world defines his body by his skin, his epidermis. It perceives him to be black, and because he's black, it interprets him as being defined by a race, and he has to then live through that gaze of the other. So he says his body schema is interrupted by what he calls a racial epidermal schema. That is to say, he has to live with the fact that he has to be a black man, not just a person. And it's interrupted by what he calls the historical racial schema, which is to say the fact that he's black means that he has to live through the definition that is put upon him by the white world of who black people are. And all the imaginations, the superstitions, the theories, whatever they are, that people have constructed about the history of black people is a meaning that his acting is always going to carry in the world. But that world of the black man that's projected on him by the white world, that's a debilitating vision. And so in place of being able to act normally the way you might with your friends at the party, right, he has to act in a way where everything he does has the meaning of something that's being done by a person who's a problem, a person who has a failing, a person where it would be better if they weren't there. So the first point then that Fanon wants to make is that experience of racism is not so much something that happens between two well-formed people, where this person has a nasty view about that person and then they have to deal with it. It's rather that person who is subjected to that racializing perspective is crippled in their very ability to assume the normal role of agency because they have to participate in a world that defines them as unwelcome. And that's a thing that happens at the level of the body. The second point that Fanon makes is that debilitating white gaze isn't something that just comes from those particular individuals who have nasty views, but is something that is communicated in the normal behavior of white people in general, regardless of their attitudes. So in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, where he's talking about decolonization in Africa, he talks specifically about the relationship between the society of the colonists and the society of the colonized people. And the point he makes there is essential to the understanding of racism. He says in the colonies, you have the obvious place where, the police are keeping the native people away from parts of town or whatever, where there are gates, there are checkpoints, there are prisons. So there are sites where you see violent force being used by the colonizing power against the colonized people. But of course, most people aren't doing that. Most people are just having their dinner in a restaurant or singing their children a lullaby before bed. But Fanon's point is that that border that you see being maintained forcibly between the armed police and the native people in the prison and at the checkpoint, that same border is actually being reinforced through all those other activities as well. He says when somebody's getting a award for 30 years of service, or whether the parents are having loving relationships with their children, or whether people are going to school, in all those ways, the people in the white world are supporting and reinforcing the established order. And it's an established order in which the colonized people are excluded. And so even though those people aren't themselves there at the checkpoint with the gun, they're still enacting that violence of exclusion and suppression by their privileged behavior that reinforces that system. And that's the same point about systemic racism in general. The oppressive gaze of the white world is established through a lot more than just the border guards, so to speak, who are there enacting direct, nasty, racialized violence against people, with clubs or guns or in prisons or whatever else. It's also reinforced in all those activities in which people comfortably and privilegedly live within the established order of that white world that is significantly based upon the ignoring of and the excluding of oppressed black people. So racism isn't ever going to be satisfactorily addressed if you think of it as just a psychological issue of one person not being nice to another person. You're not going to address it properly unless you see it as a systemic issue, and unless you see that the problem of that systemic racism is that it is debilitating to people and their very ability to be agents, to be healthy functioning people.